It's the summer of 1943. Deep inside the Soviet Union, a thunderstorm is brewing. Not in the skies, but on the ground. Thousands of tanks, engines roaring like beasts, wait for the signal to attack. This was the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history, and the last great gamble of Hitler's army on the Eastern Front. What happened here would decide the fate of World War II. After the brutal winter of 1942, Germany had suffered its worst defeat yet at Stalingrad. An entire army had been destroyed, and the myth of German invincibility was shattered. But Hitler wasn't ready to give up. He believed that if he could launch one massive counterattack, he could regain the initiative and crush the Red Army once and for all. That counterattack would take place near the city of Kursk, a bulge, or salient, in the Soviet front line that jutted deep into German-held territory. To Hitler, Kursk was the perfect target. The plan, codenamed Operation Citadel, was simple. Attack the northern and southern edges of the salient simultaneously, surround the Soviet forces inside, and destroy them. Once that was done, Germany could regain control of the Eastern Front and possibly force Stalin to negotiate peace. It was a bold plan, but it was also deeply flawed. The Soviets already knew what was coming. Months before the battle even began, British intelligence had cracked German communications and passed the information to the Soviets. Stalin and his top generals, including Georgy Zhukov, immediately understood the stakes. Instead of attacking first, they decided to prepare for the German blow. What followed was one of the most extensive defensive preparations in military history. Across a 250-kilometer front, the Soviets built 8 layers of defense. Mines were buried everywhere, more than 500,000 of them. Trenches were dug so deep they could swallow tanks whole. Anti-tank guns were positioned to cover every approach. And behind those defenses, Soviet tank armies waited in reserve, ready to strike back. It was a fortress made of earth, steel, and determination. Meanwhile, the Germans were preparing their own forces. They gathered their best units, the Waffen-SS Panzer divisions, elite formations armed with the newest weapons, Tiger tanks, Panther tanks, and the deadly Ferdinand tank destroyers. These machines were state-of-the-art, with thick armor and powerful guns that could destroy a Soviet tank from miles away. But there was a problem. The new tanks were untested, rushed into production, and plagued with mechanical failures. Even before the battle began, many Panthers broke down during training. The offensive was delayed multiple times as Hitler waited for more tanks to arrive. Each delay gave the Soviets more time to dig in. By the time the Germans finally launched their attack in July, the element of surprise was gone completely. It was the morning of July 5, 1943. At dawn, the still air over the Kursk salient erupted into chaos. Artillery fire thundered across the horizon as both sides unleashed thousands of shells. The earth shook. Smoke and dust filled the sky. The German attack had begun. In the north, General Model's 9th Army advanced toward the city of Orel. In the south, Field Marshal Manstein's 4th Panzer Army pushed toward Prokhorovka. Both sides were fighting not just for ground, but for survival. The Germans threw everything they had at the Soviet lines: tanks, aircraft, infantry, and artillery. But every inch of progress came at a terrible cost. The Soviets were ready for them. As German panzers rolled forward, they were met with devastating minefields. The explosions were so frequent that engineers had to crawl under fire to clear paths through the mines. Behind every field lay another line of trenches, and behind those, more anti-tank guns. Soviet troops, some barely 18 years old, waited with rifles and Molotov cocktails, determined not to let a single German tank through. The fighting was intense and brutal. In the north, the Germans advanced only a few miles before being stopped cold by Soviet resistance. In the south, Manstein's forces fared better, punching deeper into Soviet lines. But even there, progress was slow. The weather was hot, the air thick with smoke and the stench of burning fuel. Tanks were destroyed by the hundreds. Then came July 12, 1943, the day that would be remembered as one of the most dramatic clashes in modern warfare, the Battle of Prokhorovka. On that morning, over 1,200 tanks from both sides met head-on in a narrow valley near the small town of Prokhorovka. It was chaos. Dust clouds made it almost impossible to see. Tank commanders had to fight at point-blank range, sometimes ramming each other when their guns couldn't lower enough to fire. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army, commanded by General Pavel Rotmistrov, charged directly at the German SS Panzer Corps. It was a desperate move meant to stop the German advance once and for all. T-34 tanks, fast and agile, rushed forward in waves. The German Tigers fired from a distance, cutting through Soviet tanks with terrifying accuracy. But there were simply too many. Soviet tanks swarmed around them, firing at their flanks, even crashing into them. For hours, the battlefield was a nightmare of fire and metal. Men screamed over the roar of engines. Flames erupted from destroyed tanks. The ground shook constantly as explosions echoed across the valley. By the end of the day, hundreds of tanks lay destroyed, smoking wrecks scattered across the fields of Kursk. The Germans had lost their momentum. Hitler's dream of encircling the Soviets had failed. Despite all their preparation, the German army couldn't break through. Their elite divisions were battered and exhausted. Then, just as Manstein was preparing to launch one last push, news came from the west. The Allies had invaded Sicily. With the Western Front now under threat, Hitler made a decision that sealed his fate. He ordered his armies to stop the offensive and move forces to defend Italy. The Battle of Kursk was over. When the smoke cleared, the losses were staggering. The Germans had lost over 50,000 men and nearly 500 tanks. The Soviets lost even more, almost 180,000 men and over 1,500 tanks. But they could afford it. For every tank Germany built, the Soviet Union built 5. For every soldier lost, 10 more took his place. The failure at Kursk marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. From this point onward, the Germans would never again launch a major offensive in the east. The Red Army seized the initiative and began pushing west, liberating cities one by one, until 2 years later they reached Berlin itself. But the Battle of Kursk wasn't just a turning point. It was a symbol of how industrial power, intelligence, and sheer human endurance could defeat even the most formidable war machine on Earth. For the soldiers who fought there, it was a living hell. Survivors recalled seeing tanks burn for hours, the smell of oil and death thick in the air. One Soviet veteran later said, "The earth itself seemed to be alive, trembling and screaming beneath us." For the Germans, Kursk was a psychological blow from which they never recovered. Their confidence in Hitler's leadership began to crumble. Many officers realized that the war could no longer be won, and for the Soviets, Kursk was proof that they could not only defend their homeland, but also defeat the invaders who had once seemed unstoppable. It was the moment the tide of war turned irreversibly in their favor. After Kursk, the Red Army moved forward relentlessly, liberating Orel, Kharkov, and Smolensk. By the end of 1943, the Germans were in full retreat. Every mile gained came at a heavy cost, but the momentum had shifted forever. Historians still debate whether Kursk was truly the biggest tank battle in history, but there's no question about its significance. It was the last time the Germans could attempt to seize the initiative on the Eastern Front. It was also the first time the Soviets defeated a major German offensive before it even began. In many ways, Kursk represented the evolution of modern warfare. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, logistics, and intelligence all played critical roles. It showed how the war had transformed from the lightning-fast blitzkriegs of 1939 into massive, grinding battles of attrition where victory depended on endurance, not speed. When you look back at the scorched fields of Kursk today, it's hard to imagine the chaos that once unfolded there. Quiet villages now stand where thousands once died. But beneath that soil still lie the remnants of the battle that changed the course of World War II. In the end, the Battle of Kursk wasn't just about tanks or tactics. It was about willpower. The will of a nation to defend itself against annihilation. The will of ordinary soldiers to keep fighting even when the odds seemed impossible. And the will of humanity to endure through the darkest chapters of its history. It was here, in the fields of Kursk, that Hitler's dream of conquest died and the Soviet path to victory began.